Lucas Davenport took a waking breath and rolled over to look at the nightstand clock. 6:55. He dimly remembered setting the alarm for 7 o'clock, so he had 5 minutes. If he turned it off, he might sleep for 3 hours, so he didn't. Weather, his wife, was still asleep beside him, which meant that it was the weekend, the only days she slept in. He rolled away from her toward the clock side of the bed, winced from a dull ache in his chest, and settled in for the last 4 minutes, eyes half open, looking up at the ceiling, trying to nail the exact day of the week. Sunday? Sunday. On Sunday, he had to get on an airplane. Everything was coming into focus. Lucas had been shot the previous spring. With September half gone, he was still feeling after effects, which he supposed was better than the alternative. He was working hard to get back in shape, running, lifting, punching a heavy bag. Everybody said how good he looked. When he checked himself in the mirror, though, in his own eyes he looked gray and too thin. Not wiry, but something over toward emaciated. His cheekbones had been blunt and were now knife-edged. The crow's feet at his eyes were like cuts. His watch was too loose at his wrist. He'd lost chunks of the hockey defenseman muscle he'd carried since college, and getting it back at his age, 2 years past 50, was tough. He wanted the weight. The morning scale said he was at 192, and for a cop who enjoyed the occasional fight, 200 pounds was a good starting point. Now something was happening in Washington, D.C. Whatever it wasn't good, and at the moment he wasn't in top form. Or maybe, his wife suggested, his body was fine, but his brain was still screwed up. Lucas had been barbecuing steaks in his backyard the night before for a couple of cop friends and their wives when Elmer Henderson had called. Henderson was a U.S. Senator from Minnesota, a former governor, a one-time vice presidential candidate, he lost, and one of the richest men in the state. Henderson had a 10,000-square-foot cabin on his own private 600-acre lake, staff of 6 up in the North Woods, when he needed something simpler and more primitive than his life in the Twin Cities and Washington, D.C. He had a dozen plaid shirts and numerous pairs of carefully ironed and faded jeans for the cabin life, along with several pairs of buffalo hide loafers. Lucas had once spent a weekend at the cabin, and he'd peeked in Henderson's main closet, because he was a cop and therefore somewhat curious, or snoopy, take your pick. Henderson's jockey shorts, Lucas believed, after a surreptitious inspection, were both ironed and starched. Henderson also had a smaller, more discreet cabin in Wisconsin, which he called the Hideout, where he and the other big cigars from the Twin Cities cut their political deals. Lucas had been there as well, cutting a deal. Lucas was rich himself, but not rich like the people who'd inherited wealth. He didn't assume its presence because he'd made his money during a time when he wasn't working as a cop. He'd been run out of the Minneapolis Police Department after he'd beaten a pimp who'd church-keyed one of his sources. The beating had neither cured the pimp of his inclinations nor the woman of her facial scars, but had made a point that had resonated on Minneapolis streets, at least for a while. While he was in college and later working as a cop, he'd had a sideline as a developer of role-playing games. None of them got as big as Dungeons and Dragons, but they'd sold well enough to buy him a used Porsche 911. Then computers came along, and the in-person role-playing games began to die. That occurred as he was being pushed out of the Minneapolis Police Department. With the new 911 systems then coming online, It occurred to him that American police departments could use role-playing games for their 911 systems, giving their personnel practice in responding to emergencies before they had to handle the real thing.